She disappeared for 10 years without a word. And the moment I became a millionaire, she showed up at my front door like she'd never left. I remember standing there in my kitchen, the morning sunlight stretching across the marble countertop I had picked out just 3 weeks earlier. The same countertop she once said was too expensive for someone like me. And there she was, Vanessa Whitmore, smiling like time hadn't passed, like she hadn't walked out on my son when he needed her most, like she hadn't vanished the very week our lives fell apart. And I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at her, really looked at her. The same blonde hair, a little darker at the roots now, the same careful makeup, the same posture that always tried a little too hard to look effortless. And in that moment, I realized something that settled deep in my chest, cold and clear. She hadn't changed. Not really. She had just been waiting, and I smiled. Not because I was happy to see her, but because I finally understood exactly why she had come back. And that understanding felt more powerful than anything money could buy. In the way she spoke about money, about status, about what people deserved, had always made me pause. But that night, I ignored all of it, because families are supposed to hold together when things fall apart. That's what I had always believed. But the next morning, she was gone. No note, no call, no explanation, just an empty closet and a silence that felt louder than any argument. Lucas searched for her at first, called her friends, checked her workplace, even drove across town to places she used to go, but it was like she had erased herself. And after a while, the calls stopped, the searching stopped, and what remained was something quieter, heavier, a kind of understanding that didn't need words. She had left because things got hard, because the life she wanted no longer matched the life we had. And over time, we adjusted, not easily, not quickly, but we did. Lucas found work again, not the kind he had before, but steady enough, and I started building something of my own. Small at first, a consulting service based on skills I had spent decades quietly developing, something I never thought would turn into more than a way to keep us afloat. But it grew, slowly. Then all at once, contracts came in, referrals multiplied, and before I knew it, I was signing papers that changed everything. The day I sold my company for $3.2 million, I didn't celebrate, not the way people expect. No champagne, no big announcement, just a quiet dinner at home, the same way I had always lived, because money doesn't erase memory, and it doesn't rewrite the past. It just makes certain truths easier to see. And apparently, it makes certain people reappear, because 3 days after that deal closed, Vanessa knocked on my door, and as I stood there looking at her, her smile warm, her voice gentle as she said, "Eleanor, I've missed you." I realized she hadn't come back for forgiveness. She hadn't come back for family. She had come back because, somewhere along the way, she had been watching, waiting for the exact moment when walking through that door would finally be worth it. And that was the moment I knew, whatever she thought she was about to gain, she had already made her first mistake. Vanessa did not step inside right away. She lingered at the doorway as if she understood that crossing that threshold meant something, as if she needed me to invite her in to complete whatever story she had rehearsed on her way over. And I let the silence stretch just a little longer than necessary, long enough for her smile to tighten at the edges before I finally stepped aside and said, "You can come in," in the same calm tone I would use for a delivery driver. Nothing more, nothing less. And she walked past me slowly, her eyes moving across the kitchen, taking in every detail, the new cabinets, the polished floors, the quiet kind of order that only comes when a house is no longer struggling to hold itself together. And I watched her watch everything. Because people like Vanessa always reveal themselves in what they choose to notice first. She did not ask how I was. She did not ask about Lucas. She said, "This place looks amazing," her voice carrying that same note of admiration that was never quite separated from calculation, and I nodded once, setting my coffee mug down with deliberate care. "It has changed a little," I said, and that was enough to open the door for her to begin. She moved to the kitchen island, resting her hand lightly on the surface as if testing something. Then she let out a small sigh, the kind meant to sound genuine. "Eleanor, I know I have no right to just show up like this, but I have thought about you and Lucas every single day." And there it was, the script, delivered with the same precision I remembered from years ago, the same balance of apology and self-preservation, and I did not interrupt her. I simply listened, because listening had become one of my strongest habits over the past decade. I was young, and I made mistakes, she continued, her eyes softening just enough to suggest regret without fully committing to it. Everything felt like it was falling apart back then, and I did not know how to handle it. She paused, waiting, the way people do when they expect reassurance. But I gave her nothing, just a steady gaze that made her shift her weight slightly, and that was when I noticed it, the small flicker of uncertainty beneath her confidence. She had expected warmth, or at least curiosity, but what she found instead was something else entirely, something she could not quite read, and it unsettled her more than any anger would have. Lucas is not here, I said after a moment, not as a question, not as an invitation, just a statement, and she nodded quickly. I know. I tried calling him, but I thought maybe I should talk to you first. Of course she did, because she knew exactly where the center of gravity had shifted in this family. She knew who she needed to convince now, and that realization alone confirmed everything I had already suspected. I walked to the sink and rinsed my cup slowly, giving myself a few seconds to think, not because I did not know what to say, but because timing matters when you are dealing with someone who measures every reaction. 10 years is a long time, Vanessa, I said finally, turning back to face her, and for the first time, her expression faltered just slightly, not enough for someone unfamiliar to notice, but enough for me, because I had spent years learning how to see what people try to hide. I know, she replied, her voice softer now, and I cannot undo that, but I want to make things right. Make things right. The phrase hung in the air between us, vague enough to mean anything, specific enough to sound sincere, and I wondered how many times she had used those exact words before, not just with us, but with others. Because people who leave when things get difficult rarely change their nature. They just refine their timing. I walked back to the island and rested my hands lightly on the surface, mirroring her posture without thinking. And what does that look like to you? I asked, and there it was again, that brief pause, that tiny calculation behind her eyes as she chose her next words carefully. I want to be part of the family again, she said. I want to rebuild what we had. What we had? I almost smiled at that, because what we had existed only in her version of the story, not in reality. But I kept my expression neutral, controlled, the same way I had learned to keep it in business meetings where millions of dollars were decided in seconds. That is a big thing to ask, I said, and she nodded quickly, stepping closer, just enough to close the distance but not enough to feel intrusive, a practiced move. I know it is, but I am willing to do whatever it takes. Whatever it takes, another phrase designed to sound unconditional while meaning nothing at all. And that was when I decided, not in a dramatic moment, not with any sudden realization, but with a quiet certainty that settled in my mind like a final piece falling into place, I would let her stay. Not because I believed her, not because I wanted to forgive her, but because sometimes the truth reveals itself best when you give it space to unfold. And as I looked at her standing there, hopeful, careful, already adjusting to the version of me she thought she understood, I realized she had already begun to build her next move. She just did not know that I had already seen the ending. Vanessa stayed longer than I expected that first day, not because I encouraged it, but because she understood that leaving too quickly would make her return feel less meaningful. And people like her always think in layers, not just about what they say, but how long they stay, how they move, how they let silence do part of the work for them. So she lingered in the kitchen, asking small questions that sounded casual, but were anything but. So, how have you been spending your time lately? She asked, her fingers tracing lightly along the edge of the countertop, and I could hear what she was really asking beneath it. Not about my time, but about my life, my routines, my new reality. I have been busy, I replied, keeping my answer simple, because details are currency, and I had learned not to spend them too freely. She nodded, smiling as if she already knew more than she should. And that was when I remembered something I had almost overlooked 3 years ago, before everything changed. I had received an email from an unfamiliar address, polite, brief, asking about consulting services, nothing unusual at the time. Except for one small detail, the questions had not been about my work, but about my clients, my rates, my long-term plans. It had felled off, but I had dismissed it, back when I still believed that curiosity was harmless. Now, standing in my kitchen with Vanessa watching every movement I made. That memory returned, with a clarity that made my chest tighten just slightly, because timing like this is rarely coincidence. I heard about your company, she continued, as if confirming my thoughts without realizing it. It sounds like you did incredibly well for yourself. And there it was, not a question, not even a compliment, just a statement carefully placed to see how I would respond. I picked up a dish towel and folded it slowly, giving myself a moment before answering. It worked out, I said, and she laughed softly, a sound meant to suggest admiration. That is an understatement, she replied. People talk, Eleanor. You know that. Yes, people talk. And sometimes they listen too closely, sometimes they wait. And I began to see the outline of something much larger than a simple return, something that had been building long before she knocked on my door. Do they? I asked, meeting her eyes directly now, and for a second, just a second, she hesitated, not because she did not have an answer, but because she had not expected me to ask that question in that way. Of course, she said quickly, recovering. You have done something impressive. It is only natural. Natural. I repeated that word silently, because nothing about this felt natural anymore. Not her timing, not her tone, not the way she seemed to know just enough without ever saying how. And that was when another piece fell into place, not a full picture yet, but enough to make me pay closer attention. She had not just come back. She had come prepared, and preparation requires information. Information requires access, and access always leaves a trail, even if it is a quiet one. I set the towel down and leaned slightly against the counter, mirroring the relaxed posture she was trying so hard to maintain. And what exactly have you heard? I asked, not pushing, not accusing, just opening the door a little wider, and she smiled again, that same careful smile. But this time it did not reach her eyes. Just that you sold your business for a very good number, she said, choosing her words with precision. 3.2 million, if I am not mistaken. And there it was, the exact figure, not rounded, not guessed, exact. And in that moment, everything became very clear, because that number had not been public, not in any official sense. It had been part of a private transaction, shared only with a handful of people bound by contracts and discretion. And yet here she was, standing in my kitchen, repeating it as casually as if she had read it in the morning news, and I did not react, not outwardly, because reactions are what people like Vanessa rely on. They measure them, adjust to them, build on them. Instead, I simply nodded once, as if it meant nothing at all. Something like that, I said, and watched her closely. Because now I knew for certain, this was not just about a woman returning to a family she had abandoned. This was about someone who had been watching from a distance, gathering pieces, waiting for the exact moment when stepping back into our lives would give her the greatest possible advantage. And as she stood there, confident, composed, believing she had already calculated every outcome, I realized she had made a second mistake. She had assumed that I was still the same woman she had left behind 10 years ago, the one who believed what people said instead of watching what they did. And that assumption was going to cost her more than she could possibly imagine. After that moment, I stopped seeing Vanessa as someone who had returned and started seeing her as someone who had been waiting. And once you understand that about a person, everything they do begins to look different. The pauses feel intentional. The smiles feel measured. Even the way they ask simple questions begins to sound like a strategy instead of curiosity. And as she continued talking in my kitchen, filling the air with soft apologies and carefully chosen words, I found myself drifting back through memories I had not revisited in years. Not because I had forgotten them, but because I had finally learned how to understand them properly. 10 years ago, I used to think Vanessa was charming in a quiet way. She knew how to enter a room without making noise and still become the center of attention, not by being loud, but by listening, by observing, by saying just enough to make people feel seen. And I remember the first time she came to dinner, the way she complimented the house. Not in a general way, but specifically, she noticed the curtains, the way the light came through them in the late afternoon. She noticed the small framed photo of Lucas as a child on the bookshelf. She even noticed the brand of coffee I served. And at the time, I thought she was thoughtful, attentive, someone who paid attention to details. But now, standing there watching her again, I realized something I should have understood back then. People who pay attention like that are not always being kind. Sometimes they are collecting information, building a map of the people around them, learning what matters, what can be used, what can be turned into leverage later. And there had been other moments too. Moments I had explained away because I wanted peace more than I wanted clarity. I remembered how she used to ask Lucas about his future plans, not in terms of what would make him happy, but in terms of what would make him successful, what would put him ahead, what would secure his position. She would listen closely, nodding, but there was always a subtle shift in her expression when the answers did not match her expectations, a small tightening around her eyes, a slight hesitation before she spoke again. And I had noticed it, even then, but I told myself it was nothing, that everyone has different ways of thinking about life, that it was not my place to question her intentions, and that was my mistake, not because I was wrong about her then, but because I chose not to trust what I was seeing. And when she left, I told myself a different story, one that was easier to accept. I told myself she had been overwhelmed, that she did not know how to handle pressure, that leaving was her way of coping with something she could not control, and for a long time, that explanation helped me move forward. It allowed me to focus on rebuilding, on supporting Lucas, on creating something new instead of dwelling on what had been lost. But now, with her standing in front of me again, repeating familiar phrases in a slightly different tone, I understood that she had not been overwhelmed at all. She had been calculating. She had seen the direction things were going and made a decision that benefited her in that moment. And now she had returned because the direction had changed again, because the circumstances were no longer unfavorable. And that realization did not make me angry. It did not make me emotional. It made me clear, because once you see a pattern for what it is, you stop expecting it to become something else. You look different, Vanessa said suddenly, interrupting my thoughts, and I looked at her, not surprised by the comment, but by the timing, because she had been studying me just as closely as I had been studying her. Different how? I asked, and she tilted her head slightly, as if considering her answer carefully. Stronger, she said, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was a compliment, but because it was an observation she could not quite hide. She could see it, even if she did not fully understand it. She could see that I was no longer the woman she had walked away from, and that made her cautious in a way she had not been before. And I realized in that moment that this was no longer just about what she wanted. It was about what she thought she could still take. And as she stood there, adjusting her tone, recalibrating her approach, trying to find the version of me that would respond the way she expected, I knew that whatever game she believed she was playing, she was already one step behind, because she was still working with an outdated map, and I had spent the last 10 years learning how to redraw it. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I picked up my phone and called someone who did not belong to the past, someone who had only ever known me as I am now, not as I used to be. And when Richard answered, his voice calm and steady as always, I felt that quiet sense of control settle back into place. I need to review a few things, I said, keeping my tone neutral. And he did not ask unnecessary questions. He never did. Of course, he replied. Do you want to come by the office, or would you prefer I bring everything to you? And I glanced across the kitchen where Vanessa was still standing, now scrolling slowly through her phone as if she were giving me space. But I knew better than that. People like her never stop observing, even when they pretend to be distracted. Come here, I said, and ended the call before she could hear anything more. When I looked up again, she had already shifted her posture, setting her phone down with a soft smile. Everything okay? She asked, her voice light, casual, as if she had not been listening at all, and I nodded once. Just business, I replied, and watched the way her eyes sharpened for a fraction of a second before softening again, because that one word was enough to tell her what she needed to know, that there were still things happening in my life she did not have access to, and that was something she would not be comfortable with for long. I should probably go, she said after a moment, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. I did not mean to stay so long. But she did not move right away. She waited, just slightly, for me to respond, for me to invite her back, for me to create a bridge she could cross again later. And I gave her exactly what she needed, not more, not less. You can come by again, I said, my voice even, controlled, and her smile returned, brighter this time, more certain, because in her mind, that was a door opening, an opportunity secured. I would like that, she said, and then she stepped toward the door, pausing just long enough to turn back. And Eleanor, I really am sorry for everything. The words hung there, carefully placed, designed to linger after she left, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging them without accepting them, because apologies without change are just tools. And I had learned that lesson too well to forget it now. After she was gone, the house felt different again, not empty, not unsettled, but sharper somehow, as if the air itself had shifted. And I walked slowly through the rooms, not because I needed to check anything, but because I was thinking, connecting pieces, testing assumptions, the number she had mentioned, the timing of her return, the old email that no longer felt random. All of it pointed to something beyond coincidence, something that had been building quietly over time. And when Richard arrived later that evening, carrying a slim folder instead of the usual stack of documents, I knew he understood the nature of my request without needing it explained. We sat at the dining table, the same place, where 10 years ago I had counted bills and tried to make sense of uncertainty, and now I was looking at a different kind of problem, one that required precision instead of survival. What exactly are we reviewing? He asked, and I met his eyes steadily. Access, I said. I want to know who has had access to any information related to the sale, directly or indirectly. And he nodded once, already making mental notes. I can start with internal records, communications, anyone who might have handled or seen the transaction details. And I leaned back slightly, folding my hands in my lap. And I want you to go further, I added. Look for anything unusual, anything that does not fit. He studied me for a moment, not questioning, just assessing. And then he said, understood, because he could see what I was not saying out loud, that this was no longer just about protecting assets. It was about understanding how someone like Vanessa had managed to position herself so precisely, so deliberately. And as he began outlining the steps he would take, the process, the timelines, the methods, I felt that same calm certainty return, the kind that comes when you stop reacting and start preparing, because whatever Vanessa believed she had planned, whatever advantage she thought she had secured by waiting all those years, she had overlooked something fundamental. She had assumed that information only moved in one direction, that she could observe without being observed, that she could gather without leaving anything behind. And that assumption was going to be the third mistake she would not be able to recover from. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had to, but because my mind had already begun working through possibilities before the sun had fully risen. And I have learned over the years that clarity often comes in those quiet hours when everything else is still. So I made my coffee, the same way I always do, measured, deliberate, and sat at the kitchen table, not the new island where conversations happen, but the older table I kept in the corner, the one that reminds me where all of this started. And as I sat there, I replayed every detail from the day before, not emotionally, not with any sense of anger or regret, but analytically, like reviewing a contract, because people reveal more in what they do not say than in what they do. And Vanessa had said enough without ever fully explaining anything. The exact number she mentioned, the timing of her return, the way she positioned herself just close enough to suggest trust, but not close enough to risk rejection. All of it pointed to preparation, not impulse. And preparation requires time, access, and intention. Three things that do not appear out of nowhere, which meant there was a connection somewhere I had not yet identified, and I intended to find it. Later that morning, Lucas called, his name appearing on my phone with that familiar weight that never quite goes away, even after all these years, because no matter how much changes, he is still my son. And when I answered, his voice carried something I recognized immediately, hesitation. Mom, he said, I need to tell you something. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, already knowing what was coming. Vanessa came by yesterday, I said before he could continue, and there was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a quiet exhale. Yeah, he admitted. She called me after she left your place. Of course she did, I thought, because controlling the narrative is just as important as creating it. And what did she say? I asked, keeping my tone even, giving him space to speak without feeling pushed. She said she wants to come back, he replied. That she made a mistake and she wants to fix things. And I could hear it in his voice, not belief, not exactly, but something softer, something more dangerous, the possibility of hope. And that is where people like Vanessa are most effective, not in creating trust, but in reopening old doors that were never fully closed. And what do you think? I asked, and he hesitated again, longer this time. I do not know, he said finally. Part of me thinks it is too late, but another part of me. I guess I just want to understand why she left the way she did. And I nodded to myself, even though he could not see it, because that question, that need for explanation, is exactly what she was counting on. Understanding does not change what happened, I said calmly, not dismissing his feelings, but grounding them. And he was quiet for a moment before responding. I know, he said, but she sounded different, Mom. And I allowed myself a small pause before answering, choosing my words carefully, because this was not a moment for confrontation, it was a moment for positioning. People often sound different when their circumstances change, I said, and he did not argue with that, which told me more than anything else could have. She wants to come by and see me, he added, and I wanted to ask you if you think I should. And there it was, the opening. The point where everything could shift depending on what I said next, and I did not rush it. I let the silence sit just long enough for him to feel its weight, because decisions made too quickly are rarely understood later. You can see her, I said finally, and I could almost hear his surprise through the phone. Really? He asked, and I kept my voice steady, controlled. Yes, I said. But do not make any decisions yet. Just listen. And that was the key, not to block her, not to push her away, but to allow her to continue, because the more she speaks, the more she reveals, and the more she reveals, the easier it becomes to understand exactly what she is trying to build. After we hung up, I placed the phone back on the table and looked out through the window. The morning light now fully settled across the yard, and I realized that this was no longer just about what Vanessa had done in the past. It was about what she intended to do now, and for the first time since she walked back into my life, I could see the structure of her plan more clearly. Not every detail, not yet, but enough to know that she was moving carefully, step by step, trying to reestablish her place, trying to rebuild influence, trying to position herself where she could eventually reach what she really wanted. And I also knew something else, something she had not accounted for. She believed she was guiding the situation, but in reality, she had just stepped into a space where every move she made could be observed, measured, and understood, and that was exactly where I needed her to be. 2 days later, everything began to move exactly the way I expected it would, not quickly, not dramatically, but with that slow, deliberate shift that only becomes obvious when you are paying close attention. Lucas agreed to meet Vanessa at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place that feels neutral, quiet enough for conversation, but public enough to keep emotions contained. And when he told me where they were meeting, I did not ask to be there. I did not suggest anything beyond what I had already said, because interference would only disrupt the pattern that was beginning to form, and patterns are far more valuable when they unfold naturally. Later that afternoon, he called me again, his voice different this time, less uncertain, but not entirely resolved. We talked for almost 2 hours, he said, and I could picture it clearly. Vanessa sitting across from him, leaning forward slightly, her hands wrapped around a cup she probably barely touched, her voice soft, controlled, guiding the conversation without ever appearing to do so. And I asked, not pushing, just opening the space for him to continue. She said she was scared back then, he explained, that everything was falling apart and she did not know how to handle it, that she thought leaving was the only way to protect herself. I listened without interrupting, because explanations are often rehearsed long before they are spoken, and the ones that sound the most reasonable are usually the ones that have been practiced the most. She also said she has changed, he added. And there was that word again, changed, the same word people use when they want to separate themselves from their past without fully acknowledging it. Did she tell you what she has been doing for the last 10 years? I asked, and there was a brief pause, not long, but enough, some of it, he said, which meant not all of it, which meant she was still controlling the flow of information, revealing just enough to build credibility without giving him anything he could verify independently. She said she moved around a lot, tried different things, worked in consulting for a while. He continued, and I noted that carefully, because consulting is a vague term, flexible enough to mean almost anything, and often used when specifics would raise more questions than answers. And how did she find out about me? I asked, keeping my tone neutral, as if it were a minor detail, and this time, the pause was slightly longer. She said she heard through mutual contacts. He replied, and I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was predictable. Mutual contacts, another phrase that sounds plausible without being verifiable. I see, I said simply, and let the silence settle, because sometimes the absence of response encourages people to keep talking. She wants to come over for dinner, he added after a moment. Both of us, together, she thinks it would be a good way to start. Over. And there it was, the next step, not rushed, not forced, but carefully positioned, a controlled environment where she could present herself in a more personal setting, where she could observe, adapt, and adjust her approach based on both of us at the same time. And what do you think? I asked again, giving him the same question in a different moment, because answers often change depending on when they are asked. I think I want to hear her out, he said. And this time, there was less hesitation, more clarity, not necessarily belief, but willingness, and that was enough for her, because willingness is the first door that opens. Then we will have dinner, I said, my voice calm, steady, as if it were the most ordinary decision in the world, and I could hear the relief in his exhale, because he had expected resistance, expected hesitation, expected me to hold on to the past in a way that would make things more difficult. But I had no intention of doing that, not because I had forgotten, but because remembering is far more useful when you do not let it control your actions. After we ended the call, I stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the quiet street, the same street that had seen 10 years of change without ever announcing it. And I thought about the dinner that was now being planned, not as a reunion, not as a reconciliation, but as an opportunity, because in a setting like that, people reveal themselves in ways they do not expect, in the way they speak, in the way they react, in the way they try to guide the conversation without appearing to do so. And I knew that Vanessa would come prepared. She would have her words ready, her expressions measured, her story refined. But preparation can only go so far, because no matter how carefully someone plans, there are always moments they cannot fully control, moments where the truth slips through in small, almost invisible ways. And those are the moments I was waiting for. Because while she believed she was moving closer to what she wanted, she had not yet realized that every step she took was bringing her exactly where I needed her to be. The evening of the dinner arrived quietly, without any sense of occasion, which was exactly how I wanted it, because moments that feel ordinary tend to reveal more than ones that are staged. I set the table myself, not out of necessity, but out of habit, placing each plate, each glass, each piece of silverware with the same care I had learned years ago, not because it would impress anyone, but because details matter, and they always have. The house was calm, steady, nothing exaggerated, nothing designed to send a message, because the strongest position is the one that does not need to prove itself. Lucas arrived first, his expression thoughtful, not tense, but not entirely at ease either, and I could see that he had been thinking about this moment more than he wanted to admit. She will be here in a few minutes, he said, setting his keys down on the counter, and I nodded, continuing what I was doing without rushing, because there is no advantage in appearing eager. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang, and I walked to the door at the same pace I always do, no faster, no slower. When I opened it, Vanessa stood there, composed, carefully put together, her expression warm but measured, and I noticed immediately that she had chosen her appearance with intention. Nothing too formal, nothing too casual, just enough to suggest that she belonged here without demanding it. "Thank you for having me," she said as she stepped inside, her voice soft, controlled, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the words without giving them weight. "Dinner is ready," I replied, and we moved to the table together, the three of us taking our seats in a quiet rhythm that felt almost familiar. Almost. The conversation began easily enough. Simple topics, neutral ground, the kind of exchanges that create the illusion of comfort without actually addressing anything real. Vanessa asked about the house, about the neighborhood, about small details that seemed harmless but were not, because each question was another piece of information, another way to understand the structure of the life she had stepped back into, and I answered just enough, never more, always keeping the balance between openness and control. Lucas spoke less, listening more, watching both of us in a way that suggested he was trying to find something stable to hold on to, and Vanessa adjusted to that, shifting her tone slightly, becoming softer, more reflective. "I know I cannot change what happened," she said at one point, her gaze lowering just enough to suggest humility. "But I want to be honest with both of you." And I looked at her, not interrupting, because honesty is often announced long before it is actually delivered. "I left because I was afraid of what life would become," she continued. "Everything felt uncertain, and I did not think I could handle it." And there it was again. The same explanation, refined, polished, consistent, which told me it had been practiced, repeated, shaped over time, and consistency like that is rarely accidental. "But I have spent the last 10 years learning, growing, understanding what really matters," she added, and Lucas nodded slightly, as if he wanted to believe that, as if the idea itself offered some kind of relief, and I let a small silence settle before I spoke, not to challenge her, not to confront her, but to introduce something just subtle enough to shift the direction of the conversation. "That must have taken time," I said, my voice calm, neutral, and she looked at me, just for a moment, and in that moment, I saw it again, that brief calculation behind her eyes, the adjustment, the recalibration, because she was not expecting that response. She was expecting acceptance or resistance, not something in between. "It did," she said, recovering quickly, "but it was necessary." Another carefully chosen word, one that justifies without explaining, and I nodded once, as if I accepted that, even though I did not, because this was not the moment to reveal anything. This was the moment to observe, to allow her to continue building whatever narrative she believed would work. The dinner moved forward, the conversation flowing in that controlled, measured way that feels calm on the surface, but carries something else underneath, and I watched her closely, the way she leaned in. When Lucas spoke, the way she paused just long enough before responding to certain questions, the way she avoided specifics while still sounding detailed, all of it confirming what I already knew. She was not here to reconnect. She was here to position herself, to rebuild access, to create a version of events that would allow her to move forward without being held accountable for the past. And as the evening came to an end, as the plates were cleared and the conversation softened into something quieter, I realized that everything was unfolding exactly as it needed to, because while she believed she was guiding the situation, she had not noticed the small shifts, the moments where control had quietly moved away from her. And as she stood at the door, thanking me again, her smile steady, her confidence intact, I knew that she still believed she was in control, and that belief was about to become her biggest mistake. The morning after that dinner, I did not rush to do anything. I did not call anyone. I did not review documents. I simply sat in the same chair by the window with my coffee and let the silence settle. Because there is a moment after something begins when the shape of it becomes clearer if you do not interfere too quickly, and what I saw now was no longer a series of separate events. It was a pattern that had finally revealed its full structure. Vanessa had re-entered carefully, reconnected, strategically, and positioned herself exactly where she needed to be, close enough to influence, close enough to observe, and just far enough to avoid suspicion. But what she did not understand was that proximity works both ways, and the closer she moved, the easier it became to see everything she was trying to build. Later that afternoon, Richard called, his voice steady as always. But there was a weight to it this time, the kind that only comes when something expected has finally been confirmed. "I found something," he said, and I closed my eyes briefly, not out of surprise, but out of recognition, because I already knew that whatever he had found would not contradict what I had seen, it would only complete it. "There were inquiries," he continued, "not direct, but consistent, over the past 2 years, different names, different firms, but the pattern is clear. Someone was tracking your business activity, your client growth, even projections." And I listened without interrupting, because this was not information to react to. It was information to place, to align with everything else I had observed. "Can you trace them?" I asked, and there was a brief pause on his end. "Indirectly," he replied. "The connections lead back to a consulting network, not large, but active. And there is one name that appears more than once, not as the primary contact, but as an intermediary." And I did not need him to say it. Not really, but I let him finish anyway. "Vanessa Whitmore," he said. and the room remained quiet after that, not heavy, not tense, just still, because confirmation does not always create emotion, sometimes it simply removes doubt. "Thank you," I said, and ended the call, placing the phone down gently on the table, because now everything was exactly where it needed to be. The questions, the timing, the return, all of it aligned, not as coincidence, but as intention. She had not been waiting passively. She had been watching, learning, positioning herself long before she stepped back into our lives. And for a moment, I allowed myself to reflect on that, not with anger, not with resentment, but with clarity, because understanding someone's strategy does not make it personal. It makes it predictable, and predictability is something you can work with. That evening, Lucas came by again, not scheduled, not planned, just a quiet visit that felt natural on the surface, but I could see that something had shifted in him, something subtle but important. "I have been thinking about what you said," he told me as he sat down across from me, "about not making any decisions too quickly," and I nodded, waiting, giving him space to continue. "There were things she said that did not quite add up," he admitted, "small things, details that changed when I asked about them again." And I watched him carefully, not because I needed confirmation, but because this was his process, not mine, and it mattered that he saw it for himself. "That happens sometimes," I said calmly, and he looked at me, searching for something in my expression, something that would tell him what to think, but I gave him nothing, because understanding is far more powerful when it is reached, not given. "She wants to meet again," he added, "but I am not sure anymore," and I leaned back slightly, considering my response, not because I did not know what to say, but because this was the moment where direction could shift, not dramatically, but enough to change the outcome. "You can meet her again," I said, and he frowned slightly, surprised. "Why?" he asked, and I met his gaze steadily. "Because when someone is building something, they reveal more as they go," I replied, and he was quiet for a moment, processing. "That? And what if I already know enough?" he asked, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of satisfaction, but of recognition. "Then you will know when to stop," I said, and that was all, because the truth had already begun to surface, not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through observation, through time, through the simple act of allowing someone to continue exactly as they intended. And as Lucas sat there, thinking, recalibrating his own understanding of what had been presented to him, I realized that the final piece was no longer something I needed to create. It was something that was already unfolding, because Vanessa had built her return on the belief that she was the only one seeing the full picture, and that belief had guided every step she took. But now, that same belief was about to lead her directly into the one place she could no longer control: the truth.